Hello, and welcome to Shaking and Sipping. This is the show where we shake up, or today's stir, a cocktail or other mixed drink, talk a bit about its history, look at a variant or two, and see how it goes. We're continuing our quest to work through the IBA's list of official cocktails to see how those stack up. We are still in the first section of the list, that's the unforgettables, and this week's unforgettable is the Vieux Carré. Now, I'm not sure if this one is quite an unforgettable. It's certainly not a drink that you hear about very often. It's a drink I'm aware of, but it's a drink with a pretty simple history with very few variants, so this should be a fairly quick and simple episode to get through. Before I start talking about the drink, one thing I want to see is just how the IBA lists it on their website. I've talked a bit about how after the first few drinks, the history section goes away, and there's often, no real notes on versions that are more traditional or more common, but one thing I'm curious about, because I'm always interested, is when international organizations, that is organizations that aren't of the same language as whatever the name of something is, do they bother to put the accents on the word? Because this word, of course, has an accent over the final E. Let's take a quick look. Yes, I am. What the heck is that? Okay, so they have bothered to put in an accent. They've gone with an accent grave, which is the wrong accent. So they've gone to the trouble of putting in the accent, but that is the wrong direction. It should be an accent aigu going in the other direction. Alright, now that we've dealt with that, as I mentioned, this drink has a very simple history. There's really only one claim that I'm aware of, so I'm inclined to go with that. All sources I've seen say that in about 1938, there was a bartender called Walter Bergeron. He was at something called the Carousel Bar, which is in New Orleans. It's a hotel bar there. And he created this drink at that time. Its name, the Vieux Carré, comes from the French language name for the French Quarter, that famous section of New Orleans, and that's it. As far as I can see, there aren't a lot of variants over time. There's a few variants that swap rye for bourbon. A few people add in two kinds of bitters except for one, and a few people serve it on the rocks instead of up. That's about it. So pretty simple. We're gonna make the IBA spec drink. We're gonna tweak it slightly, and then we're gonna go ahead and make a variant on it from a more recent Belgian bartender. So with that, let's mix up the first one. Alright, so for the IBA spec, we're going to start off, as this is a New Orleans drink, with some Peychaud's bitters, as recently seen in our Sazerac episode. We want 2 dashes the IBA calls for. I always add a third. I don't think that Peychaud's dashes out quite as much as like Angostura does, so let's go for 3. And then we want a bar spoon of Bénédictine, which I've showed before. My label fell off for some reason. This is a very interesting French herbal liqueur that we've discussed on some previous video. I don't remember which, but we want between a half and a whole bar spoon of Bénédictine. There are some folks who advocate for bumping up the Bénédictine. I think that's a fine idea. It changes the balance of the drink quite a bit, but it's an interesting, slightly floral, slightly herbal character that can push the drink into some interesting places. Then we want a sweet vermouth. I'm using Antica formula here. We want 1 ounce or 30 milliliters of our sweet vermouth. And then from here on out, we're staying equal parts. So we are going to add the same 1 ounce or 30 milliliter quantity of a rye whiskey. Again, there are some folks who prefer bourbon here. I think rye makes more sense because it has that spiciness to it, which is playing with the floral and herbal of the Bénédictine, the herbal and slight bitterness of the vermouth, and then our final ingredient is going to be cognac, so that has a bit more restrained sort of aged spirit character to it. So I think the spice of rye is a nice choice, but feel free to try a bourbon if you prefer. I think a heavily wheated bourbon, like a Maker's Mark, might be an interesting choice to soften that part of the drink and then bump up the bitters or the Bénédictine or something like that. But otherwise, I'd stick to rye. I'm using Rittenhouse, and then for cognac, 30 milliliters of the Pierre Ferrand 1840 as we normally use. That's all we need. Let's give this a stir. And we are going to strain that into an ideally chilled coupe or other small cocktail glass. And for the garnish, IBA calls for both orange and a maraschino, and they present it, as well as a lot of other folks, present it always in some sort of a package orange cherry preparation. And so we have a little cherry orange wheel here for our garnish. As always, you want to use a quality cherry here if you're going to eat it, rather than the sort of neon red cherries that sometimes get passed as maraschinos. Let's try out the IBA spec Vieux Carré. So right off the nose, just a lot going on. You get the sweetness of the vermouth, but there's a sort of brightness to it, which is, I don't know if it's the bitters and the Bénédictine together, maybe a little bit of the citrus. It just smells very inviting, bright, sweet, and not especially spirity, considering the vast amount of spirit herein. So, wow, that's a really cool drink. It's very drinkable. Despite, again, being, the Rittenhouse is 100 proof, so about a third of the drink is 100 proof. The cognac is 45 or 90 proof, so that's another third of the drink. And then obviously there's some alcohol in the vermouth and the Bénédictine. So this is a very spirit on spirit on spirit sort of preparation here, but it's very mild. So right on the tip of the tongue, I get sweetness, and I get a hair of something that is almost in the tart range. It's something in the Bénédictine and vermouth together. It's some of those flowers and herbs that are reading less as bitter or floral and a little bit more into a citrus zone, which then opens into more herbs, the Rittenhouse spice, and then I've got the cognac. Shows up a little later, but stays really constant toward back of palate, kind of filling the mouth. The nice, warm, slightly sweet, little bit of brown sugar, some age, really nice character. Yeah, that's delicious. I like smelling the orange on the nose right as I am drinking it. I do want to test what the cherry actually will do with the drink. So let's dip it on in. It's kind of wacky. The strong tartness and sweetness of the cherry really play off of some of the bitter notes in the Peychauds, in the Bénédictine, in the vermouth, and so you really get more of a bitter-sweet contrast going on, which is kind of cool. I'm on board. All right, for our second recipe, we're going to look at something from a bartender called Robbie Neskens. He created this drink in 2018 in Belgium, and this drink is called the Vieille Place, which is kind of a play on words because the first drink means old square in French. This also means old square except feminine instead of masculine. So this is his take on the drink. We're going to follow roughly the recipe from Difford's Guide on this one, though I'm going to make a couple tweaks due to some ingredient sourcing issues as well as some taste preferences. All right, we're going to start off with bitters. We're going to again begin with 2 dashes of Peychauds. And this time we're going to add to it a dash of Angostura, which again is an option that some folks prefer in the base drink, so keep that in mind if you're building your own. Now we're going to throw in about 10 milliliters of our 2-to-1 Demerara Simple, which I think wouldn't have been out of place in the last drink, to be completely honest, though it was perfectly lovely without it. And then in place of the Bénédictine, we're going to use some Disaronno, which is an Amaretto, so a sort of almond liqueur. I don't know why mine has this piece of Scotch tape on it, but it was well stuck on, so I didn't remove it. I also don't know when the last time I touched this bottle was, so not a common ingredient for me, but it's an interesting product. It tastes good. According to the bottle, it is the world's favorite Italian liqueur, which I don't know if that's true, but apparently it's the world's favorite. We want about a bar spoon, a little more than a bar spoon and a bit is what we're looking for there. Then we're going to switch from a sweet vermouth to a dry vermouth, preferably an extra dry vermouth. This is La Quintinye, and this is a French vermouth, as it were. It's kind of a unique dry vermouth. It's a little bit more expressive and herbal while still being bitter, but it has a real nose to it that makes one think of some white wines, which of course vermouths are wine-based, but this one really carries the nose of some of what you're expecting out of an interesting white wine. Then the interesting ingredient here should be a gentian liqueur, and we've discussed gentian liqueurs a bit before, especially Suze, which is a product I adore, which is not available within hundreds of miles of me for some odd reason. I was not able to source that, and I didn't want to go grab another random product. There's really no direct good substitute. So what I'm going to substitute is Amaro Alto Verde, which is a really interesting, incredibly bitter, wormwood-forward Amaro that I quite like. And we're going to take 15 milliliters, or about half an ounce, of our Amaro Alto Verde. If you have Suze in your neck of the woods, go ahead and use Suze. Though you may have to adjust the proportions a little bit, because I've adjusted the proportions to account for that. And then, just like in the original, we're going to have both an ounce each of cognac and whiskey, but in this case, we're going to be using bourbon. I'm using Knob Creek, so we're keeping proof the same. This is also 100 proof, just like the Rittenhouse. And so we want 30 milliliters, or approximately 1 ounce. And the same of the Pierre Ferrand. That's all we need. Let's give it a stir. Then we're going to strain this one onto a big rock in a double old-fashioned rocks glass. I kind of like that color. It's brown, but with a nice sort of warmth to it. I'm enjoying that. And this one we're going to garnish with a bit of lemon. And this time we're just going to express that. And toss it on in. And that is a Vieille Place. Ooh, so I'm getting that expressed lemon, obviously, right off the top. And then I'm getting a really interesting sweetness. I think it might be the Disaronno that's coming through. Let's find out. So I really like this. I'm not sure if this is going to be to everyone's taste, because that Amaro Alto Verde is incredibly bitter. It's so drying, bitter, kind of tannic, right in the middle of your tongue. It really hangs around there way after the drink. But it's such a cool drink. So it starts off and you're getting bourbon, but sort of being pulled in two directions. It's slightly sweetened. That's the dark, that's the Demerara Simple, pulling it in one direction. And the cognac is trying to keep it low but warm. The vermouth is pulling back a little bit, and then suddenly the bitterness just shows up, sort of feels like it's coming the opposite direction in the palate. And then as everything else fades out, that stays behind. So the Disaronno is not incredibly present. It is showing up at the beginning. It's part of that whole sweet bourbon thing that's happening, but it doesn't show up as its own flavor per se. Yeah, it's there if you know it's there. It's definitely doing work, but I don't think you'd necessarily pick it out otherwise. I'm really pleased with this drink. I'd love to try it in the original proportions with Suze, but the way I've got it worked out here is going to work for me just fine. All right, final thing to try here before we wrap up. I said I was going to try a variant on the original and then didn't do it. I just wanted to see what would happen if we added the Ango to this. Let me taste it again without first. Yep, still lovely. Got a nice full dash of Ango in there. Oh, yeah, it's immediately present. It calms down the front of the drink a little bit. So the front of the drink has a little bit less of that snap, which on one hand is a downside, but it means that the front of the drink rolls into the middle of the drink much more smoothly. Some of Angostura's sort of, I don't even know what they are, dark, barrel-y notes really roll in to the main part of the palate. It's good. It's good either way. I think I'd do it with the Ango though. All right, well, thanks so much for coming along with me this week as we looked at the Vieux Carré as well as the Vieille Place. If you have some of these ingredients around, I know there's quite a few ingredients in some of these, but I hope you'll make one this week or play with similar ingredients to come up with something that suits your fancy. Make sure to check the blog at shakingandsipping.com for a write-up on this and each other drink, as well as on most weeks, the day after the video posts, a write-up of IBA in real life, where we look at what happens when I go to a local Seattle cocktail bar and order this drink. We find out if they have variants on it, if it's a common drink there, etc. Follow on Twitter at shaking_sipping for Twitter type updates. Usually we'll have an update when we do have one of those IBA in real life, for example. We'll be back next week with the next drink on the IBA's list. Until then, happy sipping. Cheers.